You're listening to The Hurt Locker, the podcast that opens the door on men's mental health. And for today's guest, we have Caroline Roodhouse, author of Daddy Blackbird. Caroline, welcome to The Hurt Locker.
Thank you.
How are you today?
I'm all right. It's quite nice to sit down for a moment and talk to you. It's been a busy morning, so yeah, I'm good. I'm all right.
For the benefit of our listeners today, can you tell people who is Caroline Roodhouse?
Yes, I can. Thank you for asking. So I'm a mum first and foremost. Um, my children are Evie and Ada. They're 15 and 8 now. I work as an internal communicator. I have my own communications consultancy called Daddy Blackbird Communications. I love spending time with my children, being at home, cooking, traveling, um, and doing all the standard stuff that people enjoy doing. I love being outdoors, going for walks. I'm big into boot camp. I like looking after myself because I know that physical health is just as important as our mental and emotional health. Um, and I love reading and writing. And as you've already mentioned, I have my book, which was recently published, called Daddy Blackbird, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But that's been a massive part of my life recently, writing and publishing that.
Thank you for sharing with our listeners. So, before we do get into the book, as it were, tell me about yourself. Tell us about yourself. Tell us about growing up. Where did you grow up? How was life for you?
So I grew up where I am right now, actually, in Basingstoke, in Hampshire, um, as a normal family. And we spent a few years here. When I was very young, my parents actually saw an advert for train drivers in Liberia, and my mum suggested to my dad, "Why don't we move out to Liberia for a bit, and you can drive trains there?" Because he was a train driver in the UK, which always shocks the life out of me because my parents were not that way inclined, as far as I know. But yeah, we upped sticks and went to live in Liberia and spent about 10 years there. So that's where I started my life before we came back to Basingstoke, where we'd started. And yeah, that was an adventure and a half, in fact, and an interesting start to life. And then I did all the normal things, went to school, went to college locally, and did languages locally in the college, which was amazing. I loved French and Spanish and all things languages, and also sociology and psychology, which interest me immensely. Anything to do with the human mind and behaviour. Um, I I eventually, after a few local jobs, one of my main jobs was working for HSBC Bank for about 8 years. During that time, I met Steve, who became my husband, and I met him in the year 2000. Uh, and then that's when life sort of changed, and I became a bit of a grown up and started responsibilities and mortgages and all that sort of thing.
Can I just go back? Liberia for you growing up, a young English girl. How was that?
It was very different. I was very young at the time, so and I had a brother who was 2 years older than me, and he remembers a lot more than I do. But we lived in a kind of expat um, area where it was mainly expats in a specific area, um, and life was just completely different. Our next door neighbour had a chimpanzee as a pet rather than a cat or a dog, um, and we went to the local social club most days where we would swim and pick mangoes from the trees and Yeah, quite different to life in Basingstoke. But unfortunately, there was a civil war, and
It was.
um, we had to come home. And yeah, life then changed. And I think my dad adored being there because of the way of life, because it was all outdoors and it was social, and it was very different in terms of the pace of life.
In what way?
Everything was a bit slower, and people would stop and talk. People would be social. We'd have barbecues all weekend, and because it was an expat community, people felt close to each other and relied on each other, rather than being more kind of spread out and insular as we kind of tend to live today. It was much more of a community back then. And I think my dad missed that when we came back home. He always struggled with his own mental health, actually, and I recall times when I was sort of in my early teens where I started to notice that he wasn't a particularly happy guy most of the time, which had an impact on my parents' marriage. They eventually separated when I was 15, and my dad was a manic depressive on lots of medication, would drink a lot, and had several attempts at taking his own life, which I recall vividly when I was doing my GCSEs, in
And
fact.
you've mentioned that. So let us talk about your book, Daddy
Yes.
Blackbird. I've read your accounts and I found it sensitive, understandably harsh, brutal, honest, sincere. The book, Daddy Blackbird, is about the loss of your husband, Steve.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to go into everything about the book in of itself. And I'd like the listeners to purchase the book and read it from themselves, because you very cutely you break it down. The way you break it down, you give readers the opportunity of what to read and what not to read, which I
Yes.
like, which I like indeed, you know. And one of the things that we don't do here on the Hurt Locker, and not something that I would do in a practice anyway, would be to discuss or mention method, as it were.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you do say about Steve, about the suicide, is that loss by suicide is like grief with a microphone.
Hmm.
Everything is amplified, louder, sharper, deafening at times. And that resonated with me. That resonated with me, having experienced the loss of a dear friend by suicide.
Mm.
And before we go into the book itself, I wanted you to share with our listeners what compelled you to want to put it down on paper.
So um, after Steve died, which was in 2018, um, I had a quite a long period of time where I was just completely in shock. It wasn't expected. He went to work one day and didn't come home again, but he had no signs of ill health, depression, anything like that, and there was definitely no suggestion outwardly at all that this was even in his mind. So I remained in shock for such a long time. And you've mentioned um, the analogy that I share of it being like grief with a microphone. It's just the emotions of shock and just complete feeling abandoned, the sadness, the anger, all of these emotions are just enormous and they're very hard to cope with. It's just one day after another of trying to get through living with these emotions. And eventually, through a lot of time, support from friends, therapy. I decided it was time to try and get some of these thoughts and emotions out of my head and onto paper, just to try and kind of create some space between them and me. Um, and I didn't intend to write a book. It was literally to try and get them out of my head. And I would just write every day a little bit, and it turned into kind of chapters. I'd sit back and look and think, I'm actually starting to create a book. And because of other issues that we've had and other big challenges and adventures and stories and traumas, people would often say to me, you really ought to write a book about everything that's happened. And I kind of said, well, I'm starting to actually. I'm starting to see that this is shaping into a book. So it was a kind of organic evolution rather than a plan to write a book. Um, and in my head initially, I because I'm a communicator and my life is all about strategic communication, I needed to make sure that I had a proper audience that I was writing for when I finally decided that yes, I will write a book. And I chose the audience of people like me who had lost a partner to suicide, had children, had had this traumatic event, and then were thinking, "What the hell am I going to do now? I'm screwed." Um, and I wanted people like me to feel less alone in that shock and that awful, isolating place. And that's where it began. And I would talk about a lot of this on LinkedIn, being my kind of social media platform of choice. And I would get messages all the time from people like me saying that they were feeling less alone and they appreciated my openness. But I then started to get messages from men who were saying, I really appreciate your openness. I never realized what things were like for families after somebody had died. I have been thinking about taking my own life, but having read your accounts and understood the pain that it's caused for your children and your family and for you, I can't do that to my own family. And you've literally saved my life. And I remember the first time I received a message like that, I was so overwhelmed. I didn't know how to respond. I was grateful for the bravery of that man for reaching out and saying that and understanding what that must have taken for him to do that. And then I started to get more and more of these messages, and I realized that writing my book, I had an opportunity to speak to more than that one audience of being people like me. I also wanted to speak to men in a position where Steve might have been, and men like the ones that were reaching out to me, to at least present to them what life is like for a family after loss by suicide, and then let them make their own minds up, about the situation that they were in and what help they may be able to seek. And that's why I've ended up sectioning it into these different areas where people can go and read about what happened afterwards, or they can dive into the middle section, which is aptly called horror, because that's what it was. Um, but I've given different audiences the different choices to pick up at different parts of the book where they feel they'll get most value. Um, that's that's where it ended up, for different people.
When you did start, or when it started to trickle in, men were responding and saying, "Thank you. Reading your account has saved my life." Was there a realization that, gosh, I'm not alone here? There's more and more people. Because one of the things about being bereaved and or affected by suicide is that there's a tendency to feel alone, that you're stuck in your own grief, your own shame, your own isolation, and that nobody else in the world can even have a modicum of insight and understanding of what you're experiencing. So when people did start to reach out, how was that for you?
It was a revelation, and for the very reasons that you've said there. The last part of my book, I break into three different sections about my healing journey, and the first one is all about the power of me, The second part is the power of my children, but the third part is the power of community. And I was starting to develop a community of people that I felt part of that was helping with that sense of isolation. And I suddenly felt like I was part of something quite special, of people damaged, of people in pain, of people on a recovery journey of their own, of people who were healing, supporting one another. And you almost develop this sense of it's a bit like a radar where you can kind of spot someone a mile off who's been bereaved by suicide or who is impacted in some way, and they kind of come into the fold and they become part of that community, and you have a real empathy and a sensitivity to look after one another. And since that started, I've never felt alone. And I'm on my own with the two girls. I'm quite isolated, physically. I'm an introvert. I have a lot of social anxiety at times, but I've never felt more surrounded by support since developing this community of people who are damaged by suicide in one way or another.
Would it surprise you then to know the stats, or wouldn't it surprise you to know that the stats year on year, almost 1 million people are impacted and are bereaved by suicide?
It doesn't surprise me. I'm very conscious of those stats, and when you break it back down to one death by suicide impacts around 135 people, and like
That's
you say,
Julie Sorrell's research, yes.
indeed, yeah, and you multiply that up just in the UK, it is literally just under 1 million people who are impacted in one way or another. So there are thousands of people right now impacted and needing support and feeling that sense of isolation that I want to reach out to. I want to let them know that they don't have to be alone in that grief or in that place. So yeah, absolutely. It doesn't surprise me at all that that's massive numbers year on year compounded, and then the impact on top of that and the statistics around people who are bereaved by suicide who then start to have that sense themselves of maybe falling down into depression and wanting to maybe consider taking their own lives because of what they've been through and the impact of that trauma. It's an ongoing cycle that needs to be broken.
Does it shock you, having done your own research? I know the book's released, etc., but does it shock you how, I'm going to say it, how little there is out there in terms of support?
It does, and it's quite deceiving for me because I operate in this world 24 hours a day. Almost everyone I know is in this world.
Communicating,
Yeah,
talking, etc.
about
Yes.
suicide, about building communities, about prevention, about postvention. So for me, almost 100% of every thought is about suicide prevention and postvention. But stepping out of this world into a world where it's surrounded you're surrounded by other things, that yeah, that lack of support is massive. And the lists, waiting lists for talking therapies and things like that is just astounding. I understand why we're in this situation, but to know that the challenge that different groups and organizations and charities have in front of them to try and offer support and be there is just massive. And yeah, it's frightening.
Before we talk about Steve, in the book, 10 years previous, you went through a lot of, you and Steve went through a lot of loss yourself, as it were, you know. Steve,
Yes.
the loss of his dad and his mum, you know, brain tumor and road traffic collision, respectively.
Hmm.
And then your own dad's terminal illness.
Yep.
And you've alluded to your dad's being a manic depressive.
Hmm.
And one of the things that struck me was how he attempted suicide on the day of your history GCSE exam. You were 15 years old, and you just, yeah, it's
I I
happened.
I have a 15-year-old daughter now, and
Oh
she's
God.
preparing for her GCSEs right now, and she's taking history. She's very similar to me in every possible way, and I look at her and think that's where I was when my dad was, laying on the floor having done what he did and needing to, get support from my next door neighbour just so that I could go to my GCSE. And I'm pretty sure, I can't remember 100%, I'm pretty sure I got a B, and I don't know how that happened. Um, and when I say Evie's the same as me, she's predicted an A, so she's better than me. But yeah,
But that
it
period of time in 2008 was a tumultuous time, as it were.
absolutely, yes. I mean, going back to my dad first of all, and those attempts at suicide and the impact that that had on me, when I first met Steve, who was solid and reliable and fun and happy and settled and all the things that my dad did not represent. I was so drawn to everything that Steve represented because I didn't ever feel that he would let me down in the way that my dad had continuously tried to do so. And that's how I felt, and that's how I saw it at the time. Um, and yeah, things were great with Steve when we first met, and we traveled the world and we did some amazing things together. And then I had an accident which kind of put me out of action for a couple of years, which was horrendous, and Steve was amazing supporting me through that. Um, and then we started family, and as you say, that was 2008 when things started to go downhill, and I was pregnant at the time with our first child, and his dad was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and then the following year his mum was hit by a car and she died as well. And that grief, I'm pretty sure, impacted Steve. He didn't talk about it, um, but there's no way that anyone would be able to live through things like that and not be impacted. And it's something that I talk about a lot, particularly as we're more and more conscious of the impact of grief at moments like this, with it being Grief
Absolutely.
Awareness Week.
May I ask, at that time, you do comment in the book that you believe that period of time significantly contributed to Steve's decline in his mental health and all that. Was that not at the time? I mean, hindsight is a smug bugger, as they say. But at that moment in time, casting yourself back, did you not think that these are red flags here?
I think that's a fascinating question, and it's one that I ask myself a lot. So when we go back to that, like I said, we'd been through. I'd had this really severe accident during our honeymoon, actually in Australia, and it had taken a lot for us to get through this and come out the other side. We were damaged physically and emotionally by this accident, which was a life-threatening thing. And I think it kind of we'd got married, we were starting to grow up a bit. We had a mortgage and a home and responsibilities, and that was starting to change who we were. We weren't kind of free and young and having all of that freedom to go and do what we wanted to do. And that meant changes in who we were. And we were slowing down a little bit. We had different issues with work and jobs and things like that. Then we had the children, and they never slept, and they were ill, and they were in and out of hospital as babies, and people were dying, and life was just shit
Yeah,
for a really long time. And
yeah,
I realized that that was having an impact on me. That would have an impact on anyone. It doesn't mean that we jump to the conclusion that somebody's gonna go and take their own life because of that.
100%, 100%, 100%.
It certainly means that we're we're challenged and we're struggling and we've got some big issues to work through, but we did work through them and we got out the other side and things started to brighten up. The children started to get older, and less fragile and ill all the time. Even starting school, and you start to feel that sense of freedom creeping back again, and you think, actually, I can be a person in my own right, not just somebody that looks after babies. And Steve had been through ups and downs with work, but it felt like he was coming out the other side of that period. So whilst I recognized, yes, we'd been through a really hard time and it had an impact on both of us, there was no way it wouldn't have had an impact on us, one way or another. So it's maybe I underestimated the impact that it did have.
I mean, something that I found reading the book was that how attentive Steve was, not
Mm,
only to when Evie was born, as it were, and engaging, but also attentive to you as well, because you admit within the book about experiencing postnatal depression yourself, etc. And I got a sense that Steve would pull up the slack, as it were,
yeah,
and be there very much so. He wasn't one to go hiding. He wanted to be in the arena with you all.
absolutely. He was the most caring person you could imagine, and you've described it really well. He took up the slack when I was struggling, um, for a long period of time. It felt like that was his natural way to be, his natural personality, and one of the things that I was really drawn to. Um, but I do reflect back on that now and think that perhaps he was taking too much on and creating a degree of pressure in his head that he couldn't then cope with, um, and then wasn't able to articulate. Um, but yeah, he was attentive to the max, um, which was obviously a massive loss when he died because he'd been there for so much of our lives. And I describe it as we were a square, a very solid square with four sides and four corners, two children, two adults, and we worked as a team. And when Steve died and I lost that that big part of who we were and we became this wonky little three, it just didn't work for me and we couldn't function anymore. And I don't think Steve realized the degree of support that he provided and also the impact that it clearly had on him
It's funny.
detrimental.
It's funny, in the book, there's pictures of him, and it's interesting now. I don't know about anybody else, but for me, when I looked at him and his face, and I saw such a gentle, carefree, sensitive individual, and he was in his work was engaging in the world of telecommunications, as it were, and that's a really cutthroat business.
Yeah.
And it's a particular type of person that can survive in that, and when I looked at his pictures, his face, and being on the beach and all stuff like that, it felt like a disconnect.
Yeah, I think that's made me very emotional the way you've described him there because he was a very gentle soul. And sometimes I think this wasn't a place for him because he was so kind and gentle and he was so well respected as a leader, as a friend, as a manager. And some of the experiences he had at work clashed massively with that and that cutthroat environment and that toxic workplace culture that he was thrown into at times that just didn't work for him. He was born to drive a VW around Australia with a surfboard on the top and grow long hair, which was longer on one side than the other. That was Steve, and I hope wherever he is now that That's what he's doing.
Inshallah, inshallah. Caroline, I'm going to be led by you now, but we're going to talk around Steve's death itself.
Mhm.
I know for me, and I don't often speak about my own losses, but like I say, hindsight's a smoke bugger. And when you look back at the loss of people, friends that you've loved to suicide, you never see it on the horizon that this could be even a possibility. I'm going to introduce you, allow you to pick up and talk from wherever. I know he was starting a new job, wasn't he?
He was. So I mentioned there that he had previously worked for a big global organization through the agency that he worked for, which was an awful place where the culture was horrendous, and they would they had their kind of in crowd, and if you weren't part of that, you weren't treated well at all. And Steve was not part of that, being an outsider and being part of an agency. He was shouted at, things were thrown at him, he was spat at, and he would come home and tell me about how horrendous this was, and I could see the impact it was having over time. And I insisted that he speak to his agency and get moved to a different account, which he didn't want to do. He didn't want to rock the boat, cause trouble, make a bad
Why
name
was
for himself.
why was that? Because
Well,
as soon as I started reading the word shouted and spatter, I thought, hell no, that's not happening.
I
That
don't
is
know.
not happening.
Well, he'd been made redundant many times being in this environment, in this sector. He'd been made redundant so many times. He'd been to the job centre too many times, and that had taken its toll on his self-esteem. And I think anything that risked being put back in that position, he would be prepared to put up with the shittest workplace going to avoid going back to that place of being unemployed. And it took a long time for him to agree to speak to somebody and say, "I can't cope with this anymore and being treated in this way." And his agency were brilliant. They moved him to a new account. It wasn't his skill set, but it was the only thing available at the time. But it got him through, and it paid the bills. And eventually, he was offered a position doing what he did best, putting a team together to go out into the field and sell and do it really well. And that was he was due to start that on the 12th of November 2018. And I thought this was a good thing. I thought this was, after all of the challenges we'd had, this was a turning point. Um, and that morning it was 7 o'clock in the morning. He was getting ready. I was working part-time. The girls were getting ready for school and nursery. He was normal. He went off to work. I said I had a sore throat. He went flying up the stairs to get me some throat sweets because, as we know, that's what he was like. And then he waved goodbye and said he'd be back to collect Evie from Cubs on his way home, like he always did on a Monday. And that was it. I had no reason to believe anything was going to go wrong after that. But that's really when the shitstorm of life happened. I had a call from his workplace to say that he hadn't arrived. I presumed his car had broken down because I had no reason to believe otherwise. And because he was so attentive, it was odd that he wasn't answering his phone. But I assumed he was in an area where there was no signal. But throughout the day, it was apparent that there was something wrong. And eventually I reported him missing to the police. And that's when I went into full on panic mode, and I was calling friends and family. And he didn't come home that night or the next day or the next night. And the police were coming every sort of 12 hours to update me on what they were doing to find him. But because he wasn't a high priority case, because there were no concerns about his mental health or that he would be out there doing harm to himself or anybody else in any way, there wasn't much in the way of resources being put into looking for him. But on the Wednesday morning, I was at home. My friends were around me. We were talking about what to do to find him. And the police pulled up outside, which I presumed was their normal routine visit, but I could
Can I
feel.
just can I just stop you there?
Mm.
You described that so well. I think it's 2 is it female police officers
Yeah,
that
they got out the car.
they get out the car and they take the hats off
Yes, because when
and
you
they
see them on the
yeah,
TV doing that, it's that mark of respect, and I
yeah,
could see that this was different, and normally it was just one person, but this time it was 2, and I knew something different was going on, and it was about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I was in the living room, and my mum answered the door, and I heard this noise, which I eventually worked out was my mum screaming, and she almost tried to stop them coming into the house to tell me what they were coming to tell me, and the next thing I knew, one of them was holding me firmly by the shoulders and looking me in the eye and said, "We found him. He's not alive, and it's clear he's done it to himself." And that's the moment when everything changed forever and everything fell apart and nothing ever made sense again after that. Um, and we had to, when I say we, my best friend and my mum and a few other friends that were around at the time, and some people that just kind of randomly turned up in my house, from the police to people from school. We then had to work out what happened next, and the very next thing I knew I had to do, whilst sat on the floor clutching my sick bowl because I thought I was going to be sick, was walk to school to tell my oldest daughter Evie that her dad was dead. And that was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I don't think anything will beat that. Um, my oldest was 9, as I say, at school. My youngest was 2. She was with me, and she was being looked after in the corner by police officers, just bewildered and too young to know what was going on.
absolutely.
But Evie was my priority. And
You make a decision very, very quickly to
yeah,
tell Evie.
the reason I made that decision so quickly was because my best friend contacted an amazing charity called Winston's Wish, who
Yes,
literally said, "You need to do this, then do that, and then,"
brilliant,
and
brilliant. Winston's Wish is brilliant.
they are amazing. And there's so much support they've given us since then as well. But they basically gave Emma a script for me to just repeat to Evie, because I had no clue whatsoever. I mean, put yourself in that position, anybody with children. What do you say to a child? What words do you use to say your dad's dead? He's taken his own life, and that's it, game over. And where do you start? So they they were so helpful. And I remember walking down to the school, which is only a 10-minute walk, with Emma by my side, just repeating the words over and over again. And they were very clear that you have to be brutally honest. You cannot leave any room for doubt.
Or ambiguity.
Exactly.
And you describe in the book walking up, the look on Evie's face, the expectation in the face. How come mum's turning up here now? The deputy head having to go into the room, etc.
Yeah.
And
She was excited to see us. She thought,
yes,
"Oh, look, there's mum and my godmother. Something fun's happening here."
yeah,
And I had to shatter that once we went through the doors and sat down in the parents' room, surrounded by kind of leaflets about after school clubs and, all of that school related stuff. And to sit there in that environment, and I said the words, "Daddy's brain has stopped working. He's not alive. He's been found dead, and we're not gonna see him again." And then I just sat back and had to kind of observe to see that she'd understood what I'd said, and she cried, as you'd expect. And then as we were walking home, she started talking about her morning at school and what she'd been doing, and what the fuck?
and the forthcoming school trip.
Yeah, which was the next day, the school trip to Butser Farm, where we were gonna go and learn about ancient practices on farms, and I'd signed up to be a school parent volunteer, and we still went that
You
next
still
day. We still went, and people were saying to me, "You can't let them go to school and be alone in this environment." And I said to Evie, "What do you wanna do?" And she said, "I wanna go to school." And I said,
brilliant.
"Fine, let's go." And we got up the next day. God knows how we functioned, but we made our packed lunches and our cheese sandwiches, and we walked to school, and we got on the coach, and I remember running out of the room every time I felt sick at Butser Farm thinking, I can't do this." But Evie was sat there listening and joining in, and yeah, it's interesting understanding what a child needs, and it's continuity and routine and structure and love and not a lot else.
And honesty,
Yes, honesty,
and
absolutely.
honesty, honesty, and even though you described it as a surreal experience, I think what you did was prepare the foundation so that if Evie needs to come back and add to this narrative as she gets older, then the footings, the foundations are solid, and you can
100%.
just build on that bit by bit by bit.
Yeah, and
And
the interesting thing is there's 5 steps that Winston's Wish help you with, and you can adapt them to your own family and your own circumstances, and I went through those 5 steps with Evie very quickly over the course of a few weeks, to the point where she asked me how he did it, and I had to tell her exactly what he did. Um, Again, a horrendous moment, but because Ada was 2, those 5 steps started then, and they're still going on now. We're only just reaching step 5 over 6 years.
wow,
With Evie, it was probably 6 weeks,
yes.
but because of the difference in ages and understanding.
You know what? You know, I always describe in training that the amount of knowledge a child will absorb will be dependent on the size of their shoes.
Oh, I love that. And it was. Ada had tiny, tiny shoes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's all you do. You just add bit by bit by bit so that they can absorb.
Yeah. But what's fascinating as well is that Evie's been part of that narrative, because she's been able to help me with Ada's journey.
Brilliance.
And she's doing amazing things, and she's now a mental health ambassador at school. She's just won a national mental health award for sharing her story publicly, and talking about the language that's used around suicide and how we need to be more considerate of that. So she's an amazing role model for her sister, and there's no doubt that they are going to be something special. Well, I would say that because 'cause I'm their mum, but they're incredible human beings, and I put a lot of that down to that conversation with Winston's Wish on day 1. Do this, and then do that, and then say that, and we did, and I'm so grateful for their support and their ongoing helpline and guidebooks and focus groups where we've been able to meet up with other kids and things like that, and yeah, I couldn't have done it without them.
I'm digressing slightly, but does that then enable you to have those more honest conversations with Evie about her own mental health and your own mental health? You're smiling there. Come on, talk to me.
Gosh, nothing we don't talk about, the 3 of us together constantly, and, I'm gonna have to read this to you, and I don't know if we can share this, but I'm gonna read it to you anyway, because she sent me a message today. She messages me every day, and she said, "We were just walking down the English staircase to break, and it was so crowded, and this boy yells, 'Evie, Evie, Evie,' over and over, and I eventually said, 'What is it?' And he yells, 'How you doing, girl?' And I said, 'Fine.' And Louis goes, 'Oh God, he's trying to flirt with an angry feminist.'" And that's Evie all over. She classes herself as an angry feminist. She's on the debate club. Um, there's nothing she won't talk about, not just with me, but openly. And she's got very high sense of moral integrity and fairness, and she's an ally to everyone, and she talks about it all the time, and she's outraged by the state of the world right now. Um, but yeah, she'll open up about everything from our own personal issues and challenges at home to the state of the world, and she educates her sister on all of that. So she's exactly the same. Um, and I've no doubt that when she's got boy troubles or girl troubles or whatever trouble she's facing, or mental health challenges of her own that she's dealing with, that she'll be open and honest with them too, because we've got that environment at home where there's no line that can't be crossed when it comes
Right,
to being open and having conversations. And I
right.
think if one good thing has come out of what happened with Steve, it's that.
I get a sense as you talk about it in glowing, gushing terms that she's got a sense of her own being, as it were, of who she is.
Yeah, 100%. And at 15, it's I wasn't like that, not in any way. I was pretty lost at 15, and it's great to see that she knows who she is, what she wants to do with life, what she's doing next, how she wants to help other people. She sings, so she's got different kind of creative outlets for her feelings as well, and she writes all the time. They're both the same. They come out of school and their brains are buzzing with songs and stories, and they can't wait to get home to their pen and paper to write it down. And she'll write a dozen stories in a night or a dozen songs in a night. And she literally just went to a recording studio at the weekend, and I watched her record a song with a producer, and she was in her element, creating and articulating and being who she needed to be. And at 15, I think that's incredible.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. Turning the attention to you. If you were struggling, I know you've got your best friend there. And
Yeah,
she's been a rock. She's been there every step of the way with you, etc.
she has.
Do you open up to her?
Always. Every morning at 5 o'clock. We have
Okay.
a we don't
Okay.
much. And we start messaging early, and we put the world to rights between 5 and 6, and then we start our days. And I go into my day knowing my the challenges of that day have been addressed, or at least put on the table. Um, and I know that she's there throughout the day. She's an amazing person, but I've also got what I call my broader kind of cheerleading community. So I through being open and honest, I've connected with other people. I became an ambassador of a brilliant charity called Doctors in Distress, and I'm really good friends with the founder of that, who lost his brother to suicide. Amandip Sidhu is an incredible human being. And another chap called Dave, who Dave Crofts, who I connected with on LinkedIn, who has helped with the book. And all of these people are my cheerleaders, and we have WhatsApp groups where I can just dump something in there and vent whatever I need to vent. And they bring completely different perspectives of kind of considered and kindness. And then another one of them will kind of match my anger at the time, because they know that's what I need to do to get it out. And then Emma will come with a bit of humor and passionate kind of kindness and hope. And they all kind of add their own different perspective, and everything just works when you've got the right people around you. And I remember thinking when I was younger that to be successful, you need to be popular and you need to have hundreds of friends. And Facebook tells us that the more friends we've got, the better we're doing. But I've got 3 or 4 in my group of cheerleaders, and that is all I need.
100%. 100%. We haven't got much longer time left,
Yep.
but I just wanted, there was a couple of there was one or two brief chapters in your book, and one that's stood out for me because it was quite honest was sympathy cards suck.
Oh, I was in a bad mood when I wrote that chapter.
I felt it. I felt it.
I I feel
But
bad.
you know what? It was honest.
I know.
Come
But
on, it was
I don't wanna
honest.
be ungrateful, and I
No,
don't
it's
want
not
to
about. See, stop here backpedaling now. Come on, stop that now.
Yeah, so I fucking hate sympathy cards, and I hate flowers because they go smelly and old, and, sorry to anyone that sends me flowers, or sympathy cards, and I appreciate the need for people to do something, but a card with a dove on it is not it. It's if you're going to help somebody, be proactive. Don't say to people, "You know where I am if you need me," because if you write that in a sympathy card to me, I will burn it. I do not want people to say to anyone ever, "You know where I am if you need me," and then step back and wait for them to come to you because
Absolutely.
they won't. Um, there, how's that for honesty?
That's
Um,
brilliant. That's brilliant.
be there, reach in, be
Absolutely.
be that person that comes out frequently and says, "I want to help you. Can I do this, this, or this?" Um, don't say, "How are you?" Say, "Talk to me about how your morning's been. Are you eating okay? Are the kids doing all right? What can I do to help them this weekend? How can I take this shit off your hands and do something to make your life easier today?" Um, be proactive, be specific, be there, be
You,
consistent.
you know
Um,
what? There's research done by Suicide Bereavement UK. They interviewed 7,158 people, and in their research, 65% of those individuals who'd either been bereaved and or affected by suicide said that they wanted support in the first week that was proactive,
yeah,
actually people going into them. And that figure rose to 90% in the first month.
yeah.
And I raised that because too often as a therapist, when we experience normal grief, we're told that, yeah, leave that person for 3 to 6 months so that they can process their loss and all of that. That's what in the therapeutic communities, it was a game changer when I saw that information
Mm,
because, as you've attested to, people need to be reaching in, they need to be supportive, they need to
yeah,
be available, proactive in terms of what they can do. Otherwise, what's the point? Words
absolutely.
aren't going to do anything.
Even now, not just in the first month or 6 months, but even now, 6 years down the line, Emma will do things like I can't do maths. I'm a words person. I hate numbers. They make my head hurt. But Emma's pretty good, and so are a few other people I know, and they will do an online call with the kids who are doing maths homework, or they'll take them out for a pizza, or they will listen to the songs that they've recorded because I've listened to them 5 gazillion times already, and I can't say again, "That was amazing, darling." I need someone else to say it. So be there to be the person that does that for me as well. It's
Can
all
I,
of this constructive
I'm
stuff.
sorry, I'm sorry to jump in, but
It's fine. I know
bloody
we
hell, where does that love come from?
for my babies,
It feels that you're just enveloped in love
I
and
am,
care
and
and
I
support.
tell people that there's a few there's a few people that didn't embrace that love, and they've been kicked to the
Forget
curb.
about them. We're not talking about them. We're not bothered about them.
But no, these people they're just incredible people. They're caring people. They've been through their own issues and challenges, and they see the potential in my girls, and they see that we're worth investing in, and that I give back as well, and that we have fun together as well. It's not all about me being bereaved and them helping me. We'll have a laugh and we'll take the piss and we'll do all the things that we do as friends as well. So um, I feel very, very fortunate to have a few people around me that are like that. And I've had other traumas since Steve's death, which I talk about in the book, and more recent ones with things like work. And they've been there for that too. And yeah, it's like a family that doesn't need to be blood. They're just piece of
Uh, mwah, mwah, mwah. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb.
100%. Don't need telling that twice.
You know. Okay, I'm putting it on your toes now. Who's the most important person in your life?
Well, there's 2 of those, and that's my
Just give me one answer.
I can't do that.
You can.
Okay, it's me.
Okay, that was only through deduction that you got there right at the start, wasn't it?
It's me, and I I know, having been at rock bottom, drinking, self-harming, not respecting myself in any way, that I was the most important person that needed to be looked after and cared for and shaped into being a healthy person mentally, physically, and emotionally. And then I was able to provide for my children and be a good friend and be a good colleague and all of those sorts of things. Um, and then it's my girls.
Beautiful. I'm gonna. There is a couple of other things that I could touch upon, but one of the things that the irony of it, when you and Ahmed, etc., had to go and notify all the necessary agencies, etc., about Steve's death. There was a line that I wrote about when you were on a joint car insurance,
Oh,
and
yeah.
when you had to cancel that, your premiums went up.
I know.
And I just thought, oh my gosh.
Because I'm an unhinged widow, I presume.
Oh, I'm not even going to say any more to that. I'm just going to
Yeah.
leave that there. I'm just
Just
going
to
to leave that
clarify,
there.
I'm not an unhinged widow.
Well, we know this. We know this. The book came out. Remind me again.
10th of October, which was World Mental Health Day, purposely chosen for that day, which was also the day that Evie got her mental health award. So it was a massive day. But it's only been out for a couple of months now, which feels like longer.
And how's it being received, or is it too early?
Oh, brilliantly. If you read some of the reviews on Amazon, and if you do read it and want to review it, please do. But the reviews are just overwhelming. They're incredible. And the support from people, I think it's the openness and the honesty that people, oh, thank you. Oh, look, snap. that people that people appreciate, and that sense of somebody's being open and honest about the shit bits, and people saying they lost somebody to suicide and they didn't feel safe expressing the anger because they didn't want to upset other people or relatives or whatever. But I don't really have a filter. And I think that works quite well in times like this when people need to see the raw, open, honest, this is how shit it is kind of moments. But also the hope. And we're coming out the other side, and it's good things that have happened and good people that we've connected with and good experiences. And um, there's more of that to come. So it's a story with a kind of start and a middle and not an end, but an ongoing kind of chapter after chapter. Um, and yeah, it's been just received so well. I'm so pleased, and may that continue.
And what is it that you write? Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. You're
It's beautiful.
smiling there.
That's Emily Dickinson, who's a poet,
Yes.
and part of a bigger poem that she wrote. And I remember seeing that because it's called Daddy Blackbird. And I don't think we've got time to explain why, but you'll find out if you read the book why it's called Daddy Blackbird. But the connection between the birds and that poem was just magical, and I couldn't not include that.
Definitely. Caroline Roodhouse, thank you so much for being on the Hurt Locker. I've loved having you on today.
Thank you for listening to me.
It's a wrap, Tim.
Yes, Tim, it's a wrap.
The Hurt Locker is a safe space for our guests to openly share their mental health experiences. If you have been affected by any of the content in this recording, then please reach out for support. If it is an emergency, dial 999. If you would like to talk to somebody today, then please call the Samaritans on 116 123. Stay safe.